Well, welcome everyone to this second event of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion here at Foscari University. I'm Joseph Sanzo, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank the European Research Council for their support in general for my project, of which this is a sub-project, as well as the Ministry of Research and Universities in Italy for their support for the center. And finally, the Department of Asian and North African Studies here at Foscari. The first presentation will be by Michael Beshay, who's an assistant professor at Pennsylvania State University. And today, Professor Beshay will be giving a talk titled Channeling Spirit, Magic, Medicine, and Metaphor of Early Christian Baptism.
Well, first, thank you so much to Professor Joe Sanzo for the invitation, and also for the this exciting new Center for the Study of Lived Religion for having me come and speak today about my research. I will get right into it. Okay. Oh, is this one? All right, okay. Codex 3 of the Greek magical papyri from Egypt opens with a ritual to rouse the spirit, or I'm going to refer to it by its Greek name, the pneuma, of a cat-faced god, most likely this is Egyptian Sekhmet Bastet, with the objective of defeating some charioteers in a horse race. It's a long spell, suitable for multiple purposes, with many layers of invocations. In addition to the cat-faced god, Helios is addressed, and the names Iao and Adonai appear in the latter parts, together with the angelic names Gabriel, Raphael, and Michael. So I suspect that the final form of the ritual was once accrued in stages, but I'm not really going to discuss that here. Let's just concentrate on the first stage of the ritual, the conjuring of the pneuma of the cat-faced god, which undoubtedly is the principal part of the rite. This opening procedure first requires the practitioner to drown a cat in water. And by this, the animal transforms into a Hesios, an Egyptian word meaning one who is praised. And it's also a common epithet for the sacred dead, often applied to the god Osiris, who was drowned and restored to life. While drowning the cat, the speaker recites a formula to provoke the goddess's wrath and compel it to send its pneuma. This is on the screen. Come to me, you who are in control of the form of Helios, you, the cat-faced god, and behold, your form being mistreated by adversaries. It's a nice deflection. So that you may avenge yourself upon them and fulfill the so-and-so deed. Because I am calling upon you, O sacred pneuma. Take on strength and vigor against your enemies, them, you write them here, because I am conjuring you by your names, and we get a string of so-called Orcus Magicae. Raise yourself up for me, O cat-faced god, and perform the such and such deed. Now, following this, the practitioner must deposit 3 lamellae inscribed with powerful names into the dead cat, one in its anus, one in its throat, and the last one in its ears. And then the practitioner must wrap the dead cat in papyrus, with the names of charioteers and chariots and race horses written upon it. Make an offering, and perhaps most demanding of all, be of good cheer. And finally, he must immure the dead animal in a tomb or burial place. At this point, the practitioner evokes the daimons and chthonic gods of the place. He then takes water in which the cat was drowned and sprinkles it on the stadium or wherever he hopes to perform the deed, while speaking the following formula. I call upon you, mother of all men, you who brought together the limbs of Meliacus, even Meliacus himself, in some magical words, entrapper, mistress of corpses, Hermes, Hecate, Hermecate. I conjure you, the daimon that has been roused in this place, and you, the daimon of the cat, that has been endowed with pneuma, pneumatotos. Come to me on this very day and from this very moment and perform for me the such and such deed. This portion of the ritual concludes with several more lines of Orcus Magicae. In addition to providing a horrifying answer to the question, do cats go to heaven? This ritual of drowning a cat, endowing its daimon with the pneuma of the goddess, exhibits many parallels to the early Christian rite of baptism. What's more, I think this filicidal ritual may be the most complete analogy from the Greco-Roman world to the early Christian rite, one that, as far as I know, has never appeared in any extensive commentary on baptism. So in my talk today, I'm going to spend a good portion explaining the parallels. And along the way, I want to highlight some common tendencies and interpretive challenges in the scholarship on early Christian baptism, upon which the purported idiosyncratic nature of Christian baptism is often argued. I want to be clear that in spotlighting certain difficulties in studies of early Christian baptism, I'm not thereby discrediting or challenging these views, nor am I necessarily offering any better solutions. My goal is merely to rearrange the terms of the conversation just enough that we might discover new and productive ways to detect developments in early Christianity by reconsidering the place of baptism in the Greco-Roman world. I'm going to demonstrate the possibilities first by theorizing the relationship between three interpretive categories: magic, medicine, and metaphor. And second, by exploring the ways the specific theology of baptism as rebirth provided the conceptual structure for emergent beliefs and practices in early Christianity, apart from this circumscribed domain of baptism. And this is actually going to dip a little bit into my study of the Virgin Mary. Okay. So back to our dead cat. The first and perhaps most obvious connection to Christian baptism is the use of water. Water is the medium in which the cat is submerged, and later the same water is sprinkled upon the site where the practitioner intends the outcome of the rite, presumably because the water has been sacralized in some way. Along the lines of other prayers for justice or revenge, maybe we can critique that later, we may infer that this water is imbued with the goddess's vengeful daimon. So too, early Christian apostles and bishops submerged newcomers in water or sprinkled it on their heads, believing that by his baptism, Christ had sanctified water with his pneuma and purified it of unclean pneuma. For example, the North African theologian Tertullian writes in his treatise on baptism, "The nature of the waters, having received holiness from the Holy One, itself conceived power to make holy." This theme is expressed explicitly also in the works of the 2nd century bishop of Antioch, Ignatius, and, if Charles Boberts is correct, may be present already in the Gospel of Mark, thus revealing its widespread and early character. Even so, for Tertullian and others, the fact that Christ's baptism sanctified water did not make unnecessary a prayer for God to send his pneuma upon the water. Likewise, our filicidal ritual requires that one call upon the god to send sacred pneuma precisely while the cat is drowning, thus indicating that it's at this moment in the rite that her pneuma descends. The water functions as a channel for the pneuma to enter the body of the cat, much like it does for Christians who receive the Holy Spirit at baptism. And here I want to acknowledge that there is actually a great diversity of rites described in the early sources for Christian baptism, not all of which indicate reception of pneuma in water, but certainly many do. Now, in describing the primary purpose of the water in this way, a conduit of pneuma, we expose a significant tendency in scholarship on early Christian baptism. Insofar as scholars have sought the origins of submersion in water, early Christian baptism is almost exclusively compared to the purification rites of ancient Mediterranean religions, above all those connected with the so-called mystery cults on the one hand, and the regular washings that took place among the Jews at Qumran on the other hand. In so doing, scholars make two important distinctions. Purification rites are continuous, number one, and none of them initiate participants into a new community, number two. Christian baptism, on the other hand, is a one-time occurrence, marking the transition from outsider to full membership in Christ's ecclesia or body, a proper rite of initiation. Accordingly, scholars emphasize the idiosyncratic nature of baptism. That is because social scientific studies of initiation rites mark transitional stages of persons who are, in some sense, already part of their community. But baptism, it seems, alters the status of complete outsiders to complete insiders. Meanwhile, modern exegesis locates the significance of water primarily among the authoritative traditions of the Jewish Bible, especially the flood, the crossing of the Red Sea, the cleansing of Naaman in the Jordan, and a number of eschatological statements to the effect that God's intervention at the end of days will manifest an outpouring or deluge of sorts. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that seeking precursors and purification rites and eschatological proclamations are vitally important to the emergence of Christian baptism, but I'm cautious about the extent to which this qualifies the seemingly unique nature of it. I propose an interpretation which centers the function of water as conduit for pneuma may provide new explanations for both the foundation and development of the rites. After all, can anyone say that the cat's status or being is not irrevocably altered in the water? Perhaps the differences say more about the qualities attributed to the god invoked rather than the underlying logic of the rites. The god Sekhmet Bastet must be compelled to send her pneuma upon the waters by provoking her anger at the sight of her drowning form. Similarly, early Christians connected the profuse outpouring of God's pneuma to his wrath. The prophet John, for example, proclaims the imminent arrival of the kingdom and the unquenchable fire of God's judgment while announcing a new baptism in the holy pneuma. Likewise, the apostle Paul preached and baptized amidst warnings about God's impending wrath. This is also how theological exegetes read the New Testament phrase, baptism in holy pneuma and fire, the latter element related to expressions of God's judgment as liquid fire. But unlike the cat-faced God, the Jewish God's wrath was promised at the end of days. Hence, eschatological prophets like John and apostles like Paul could freely channel his pneuma while living in the final stages of history. Such notions likely found attraction among Christians of the first few centuries who saw themselves as a persecuted community. In other words, both contexts expect descent of pneuma coupled with anger, but whereas the cat murderer must provoke this passion for the specific aims of the right, Paul and others believe themselves to be acting according to the promises of scriptures on the side of God, whose righteous pneuma demanded justice. Another important connection between Christian baptism and the cat drowning ritual is the coincidence of dying and rising with the reception of the pneuma of the god. Again, it's during the process of drowning that Bastet's pneuma descends upon the cat, whose orifices are subsequently sealed with lamellae before the animal is entombed. The cat is reborn when its daimon is summoned, having been endowed with pneuma. Again, the Greek here is pneumatitos. Thus, rendering it Thus rendering it a Hisius like Osiris, who is drowned and restored to life. Now, so too, Christians, beginning with Paul, describe baptism in Christ's name as dying and rising with his pneuma, as Paul says in Romans, do you not know that all of us who have been baptized in Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. Paul also informs the Corinthians that the dead baptized in Christ will be raised at the resurrection with pneumatikon, that is, pneumatic bodies. This theme finds further expression in the related notion of Christians experiencing rebirth at their baptism, an idea conveyed in the Gospel of John and pervasive throughout the writings of early Christian authors like Justin Martyr, Clement, Origen, and numerous others. Death, resurrection, rebirth, regeneration is also closely associated with statements concerning the seal Christians receive at baptism, marking God's ownership of the newly initiated, as, for example, in the New Testament letter to the Ephesians. In him you also, when you had heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and had believed in him, were marked with the seal of the promised holy pneuma. In the apostolic tradition of Hippolytus, catechumens are exorcised of demons before their baptism, whereupon the bishop seals their forehead, ears, and noses. In a similar vein, the Valentinian excerpts of Theodotus cautions that unclean pneuma can accompany the baptismal candidate in the water and thereby receive the seal. Thus, one must take care to eliminate them before being baptized. Finally, reception of Christ's pneuma is frequently coupled with expressions or reminders of joy. As Paul writes to the Thessalonians, you receive the word with joy inspired by the holy pneuma. And likewise, as the excerpts of Theodotus say, it is fitting to go to baptism with joy. Now, at this point, one might object. The cat literally dies, but surely early Christians spoke of a metaphorical death and were not drowning their converts, else their movements would have ended very quickly. This points to the next interpretive challenges in studies of early Christian baptism. One finds considerable debate over the allegedly figurative or non-figurative nature of virtually every baptismal expression in the New Testament. When Romans and Colossians describe baptism as dying with Christ, is this somehow literal death or symbolic cessation of former life, a renunciation of idolatry and sexual immorality, for example? Does the phrase baptism in holy pneuma and fire denote cosmological theories about the origins of pneuma? Or does it connote membership amidst the theory or ordeal of suffering? Does baptism in Christ's pneuma refer to the acquisition of material substance? Or does it represent assimilation to Christ manifested in the good conduct of the convert, for example? When Paul describes liberation from the archons and elemental spirits, does he mean that baptism immunizes one from the actual astrological and material pressures that celestial forces exert upon humans? Or is he speaking only in terms of belief and allegiance, which one simply renounces? Curiously, the excerpts of Theodotus align with the former, let's call it, for now, literal explanation, whereas many scholars take the latter, let's call it, metaphorical position. The cat drowning ritual no doubt instructs the practitioner in non-figurative terms, down to the seemingly mechanical joy the practitioner must show while making his offering, reflecting funerary and initiatory contexts, all for the certainly non-symbolic aims of defeating his competitors. And by the same logic that the early Christian rite of anointing facial cavities creates a barrier against unclean pneuma, the cat drowning ritual's instructions to place lamellae in the dead animal's orifices is likely done to contain divine pneuma within the creature until its summoning. Now, unlike the previous difficulties, discussions of the allegedly figurative or non-figurative nature of baptismal statements in the New Testament have moved considerably over the last decades, with attention shifting from the biblical background to the Greco-Roman context of New Testament pneumatology. This movement has brought attention especially to the context of Stoic cosmology and ancient medicine, which converge in the newly emerging field of biblical anthropology. For example, Dale Martin has argued that the dualism between material and immaterial so commonly applied in the interpretation of biblical texts originates with Descartes and is thus anachronistically imported into the first centuries. The Apostle Paul himself took the materiality of pneuma for granted. Similarly, Trolls Engberg Peterson argues that passages concerning the indwelling of pneuma in Christians refers to physical events that concretely transform the bodies of believers. Pneuma, according to Stoic philosophy, is an entity composed of fire and air and located in heaven. The universe conspires, literally breathes as one, with cosmic pneuma. And Troy Martin has argued that the physiological discussions of pneuma in ancient medical texts explain the way Paul and others likely conceived its entrance into the body, as well as the dynamic, rational, salutary, and life-giving effects it produces. In so doing, Martin underscores the nutritive properties of pneuma, which enters the body through the digestive system, the oronasal passages, and most intriguingly, through moist pores of the skin, though one must admit that the moistness of the pores, while plausibly inferred from the process of bodily respiration, is not actually explicitly attested, but it's plausible. I think biblical anthropology, as I'll call it, is a promising framework for explaining not only New Testament conceptualizations of early Christian baptism, but also those among early Christian commentators. It's an approach that also allows us to uncover further parallels with our cat drowning ritual. Am I here? Let's see. Yes. Consider the phrase sprinkled with Christ's blood, a reference to baptism which appears in 1 Peter, a text sometimes characterized as a baptismal sermon. The phrase is undoubtedly a reinterpretation of the priestly practice of sprinkling the blood of sacrificial victims on Greco-Roman and Jewish altars. But what is blood if not the fluid conduit of nutrients like pneuma? According to Aristotle, the purest part of the blood, that which contains pneuma, feeds the noblest parts of the body, that is, all the ones connected to sense perceptions. The Hippocratic corpus and passages in Aristotle say that blood, which is inherently cold, is warmed by two sources, the fire of the heart and the heat carried by the flow of pneuma, though pneuma itself is cold. Galen's pneuma was the vaporous substance formed in part by the inspired air and in part by the vaporization of the arterial blood. It was responsible for the transmission of sensation and other psychological and physiological faculties. Breathing, effected through the pores, supplied and replenished the air required to mix with blood in order to create pneuma and to cool the heart. For Plato, blood likewise has physiological and psychic importance. The latter lies in its connection with thumos, located between the neck and diaphragm. Thumos is thought to be the seat of the passions, including, most significantly, anger or wrath. Blood pneuma translates the passions of thumos to other parts of the body. In Homer, thumos is additionally life breath, hence its etymological relationship to the English fume, as in fuming with anger. Altogether, one can reasonably infer that anger and other intemperate passions, virtually the opposite of pneuma, the virtues of pneuma, result in an overflow of heat, a flushing of the skin, and greater expulsion of pneuma, or at any rate, that's how the 13th century philosopher Ibn Sina understood it. Perhaps it's in this sense that God's wrath and pneuma are poured out upon the wicked, according to numerous biblical passages. And this might also explain why our cat drowning ritual compels the goddess Sekhmet Bestet to exude pneuma by provoking her anger. The water, like blood, is an appropriately cold medium warmed up by heat-conducting pneuma. And perhaps this is also why the Didache, the earliest surviving church manual of the 1st or early 2nd century, prefers baptism in running and cold water, and if neither are present, one can pour water on the head 3 times. Though fundamentally distinct, the medically based theories advanced here does not contradict the Stoic conviction that pneuma is the combination of hot and cold, or fire and water, at least not likely in the minds of the non-physicians who produced the PGM and the clients who used them, or the Christians who conceptualized, administered, and received baptism. Indeed, the heat-conducting and psychic properties of pneuma at baptism are evident in the 2nd and 3rd century works of Justin Martyr and Tertullian on your screen. In his dialogue with Trypho, the oldest extant Christian apology against Judaism, Justin refers to Jesus' baptism saying, "When Jesus had gone to the river Jordan, where John was baptizing, And when he had stepped into the water, a fire was kindled in the Jordan. And when he came out of the water, the holy pneuma lighted on him like a dove. The context is crucial. Justin is refuting the idea that Isaiah's prophecy, that the pneuma of God shall rest upon him, he's refuting the idea that this prophecy thus demonstrates that Christ lacked God's holy pneuma until his baptism. On the contrary, Justin argues that from his birth until his baptism, Christ was nourished and grew like any other human. Thus, when the waters of baptism were kindled, it was through his own power, his own dunamis. And Justin is effectively claiming that Christ's own heat-conducting nutritive pneuma ignited the waters, giving form to the dove that appeared over his head. Additionally revealing is the fact that elsewhere in the dialogue, Justin cites Jeremiah to compare baptism that washes the impurities of the flesh, external dirt and filth, with Christian baptism of psuche, from death, covetousness, envy, hatred, and behold, he says, the body is pure. This contrast between inner and outer purity is a frequent theme in New Testament early Christian statements concerning baptism, and is one modern scholars typically read metaphorically. However, if we consider the anthropological context of Justin's statements, then it becomes clear he, and likely many New Testament early Christian authors, are reflecting medically based theories that presuppose the ability of human reason to discover truth about the unseen interior of human bodies, and which presupposes interactions between sarx, psuche, and pneuma, flesh, let's call it soul and spirit. As Justin says, purification of psuche leads to purification of body. It's likely in this sense also that the pneuma of the god Sekhmet Bastet becomes attached to the daimon of the deceased cat. The first century Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria speaks of evil pneuma occupying man's psuche house, but which can be expelled, so that, quote, the psuche becomes God's house. And the second century Middle Platonist and novelist Apuleius of Madaros refers to the material body of daimons and the relation to pneuma to explain daimonic agency and the extent of daimonic knowledge. As the Hippocratic treatise, Air, Waters, Places, posits concerning the effects of heat on the body, quote, among the basic substances that predominates in any body, it kills the rest and dissolves them by its intensity, that is heat. But this damage is caused by the celestial embers emanating from certain parts, and when they penetrate into the open pores more than the body can bear on account of its natural mixture. In Justin's account of Jesus kindling the Jordan, the reverse may be implied. The abundance of heat emanating from the body overwhelms and dissolves the unclean pneuma. Thus does Jesus sanctify the waters of baptism, and the god Sekhmet Bastet the waters of the drowned cat, both of which are sprinkled efficaciously, lending concrete meaning to the expression, sprinkled with Christ's blood. Turning to Tertullian's treatise on baptism, we find further confirmation of the material pneuma and its psuche affecting activities in the waters of Christian baptism. According to Tertullian, pagans use what he calls widowed waters, in other words, those lacking masculine pneuma. They use widowed waters in their rituals, including the sacred rites of Isis and Mithras, the washing of idols, the sprinkling of thrones, houses, temples, and cities, and even baptism for regeneration and remission of penalties among Apollinarian and Eleusinian games. His point being that these waters are thought to carry medicinal virtue, though they pale in comparison to the truly efficacious waters of the living God, i.e., the spiritual God of Christians. Tertullian further enumerates examples of various spiritus that hang around water. Quote, lest any think it too hard to believe that a holy angel of God should grant his presence to waters to temper them to man's salvation. And here he's referring to the story of the angel at the pool of Bethsaida, according to the Gospel of John. So according to Tertullian, men whom waters have drowned or affected with madness or fear, they call nymphcot or lymphatic or hydrophobic. In other words, consumed by spiritus inhabiting the water. Latin lymphatic, meaning mad or frenzied, etymologically derives from Greek nympholeptos, seized by the nymphs, thus attributing noetic properties to the spiritus. Once again, we see the ability of pneuma, or spiritus in this case, to alter the passions, this time with obvious parallel to the drowning of the cat and intentional allusions to Christian baptism. Attention to ancient medicine and Stoic cosmology and what I'm calling biblical anthropology can allow us to venture deeper into the world of the Greek magical papyri and discern their relevance for understanding early Christian baptism. Morton Smith wrote an article comparing the PGM to the gifts and works of the baptismal pneuma in Paul and Luke Acts. Smith's largest group of comparanda comprises spells utilizing the pneumai of ahorai and biai thanatoi, those who suffered untimely and violent deaths. Now, on the one hand, this makes sense given Jesus' life was famously cut short by brutal execution, and some early Christians may have indeed found similarities between works of the pneuma and PGM necromancy. After all, as Smith points out, early Christians did tend to congregate in the catacombs, and also the setting of our cat drowning ritual is among the tombs. But on the other hand, it makes little sense to attribute such notions to Paul and Luke Acts specifically. For Paul, it seems Jesus' resurrection, not his death, is when his pneuma is altered. As he says in Romans, he was declared to be Son of God with dunamis according to the pneuma of holiness by resurrection from the dead. While in Luke Acts, the holy pneuma is finally conferred upon the disciples in the form of fire, one should note, after Jesus has ascended into heaven peacefully. So while PGM necromancy is interesting, I think better comparenda can be adduced based on the foregoing discussion. Let's see, do I have any minutes? The overlapping relationships between magic and medicine in the ancient world are well established. Studies have amply demonstrated the shared philosophical and practical goals of medicine and magic, as well as the ease with which practitioners and activities in one theoretical domain could constitute representatives of the other. As is well known, for example, the Hippocratic treatise on the sacred disease is the first setting in extant Greek where a body of beliefs is systematically declared to be magical. Inasmuch as magic may be described as ubiquitous in the ancient world, so too was medicine, as the necessity and discourses surrounding therapeutics permeated all levels of society and was thus shaped by local concerns. Physicians and other aspiring healers employed epigdatic strategies to impress laypersons in both literal and figurative Greco-Roman marketplaces of theories and practices. These were venues for the interface of oral and literary prognostics, dietetics, therapeutics, and ethnography. Small wonder that Christianity, a religion promising healing and relief from numerous sources of pain, was engaged in this world. Now, for my part, the only relevant distinctions between what we call medicine or magic is the former is chiefly represented by treatises that systematically explain workings of the body and that narrowly prescribed aims and methods of healing, while the latter is represented variously material literary artifacts that are much less systematic and exhibit methods and aims well beyond healing. So with that in mind, let's return to Codex 3 of the PGM on your screen. There we find a procedure which promises to do whatever the practitioner wants. The invocation begins, come to me from the four winds of the world, air traversing great God. Later in the text, the invocation continues in a series of dactylic hexametrical lines. Come to me in your holy circuit of the holy pneuma, founder of the world, O God of gods, Lord of the world, who has divided your own divine pneuma. First, the firstborn, you appeared, created carefully from waters, that's turbulent, who founded all the worlds, abyss, earth, fire, water, air, and in turn ether, roaring rivers, red-faced moon, heaven, stars, morning stars, the whirling planets. And a little later, you who were begotten in every human body, inspire us. Finally, the text ends with an invocation to the cosmic womb of creation. O womb of all knowledge, we have come to know. O womb pregnant through the Father's begetting, we have come to know. O eternal continuation of the pregnant Father. This portion has close parallels to the Hermetic prayer of thanksgiving, which appears as the epilogue to the discourse on the 8th and 9th from Nag Hammadi, and the conclusion to Asclepius, the Latin version of the perfect discourse, falsely attributed to Apuleius. In Codex 4 of the Greek magical papyri, we find an invocation that begins, Hail entire system of the aerial pneuma, hail pneuma who extends from heaven to earth, and from earth which is in the middle chamber of the universe unto the borders of the abyss. Hail pneuma that enters into me, convulses me, and leaves me kindly according to the will of God. Further on, moist, fiery, and cold pneuma is glorified as God of gods, the one who brought order to the universe. Both of these examples exhibit Stoic cosmology, according to which the universe conspires with the creative pneuma of a demiurge, possessed by all bodies, whether animate or inanimate. The universe is a living organism, the separate parts of which are held together by pneuma of fire and water. The medical pneumatics applied this Stoic concept to the human body, conceiving of health as the, quote, normal state of the pneuma, whose favorable tension can be physically discerned by palpitation of the pulse. As Dale Martin and Troels Ingberg Peterson have shown, are the very concepts that underlie Paul's material conception of the church as the body of Christ, who share one pneuma through baptism. In configuring this pneuma as a creative force of the God of gods, Lord of the world, these spells exhibit obvious parallels to conceptions of the Jewish Christian God and his creative pneuma. Indeed, we can't be sure that Jews or Christians in Egypt did not contribute to the formulations of such prayers in the Greek magical papyri. And this is just a sample. There are numerous other spells that show flashes of similar ideas, the sort that attach suke to pneuma or that draw pneuma into fire. I contend that these sorts of spells give us insights about the rich soil in which early Christian baptism was nurtured. I'm going to end with just one example, but before that, let's return to the issue of metaphor and once again, the expression in 1 Peter, sprinkled with Christ's blood. Now, as I've argued earlier, this and many related baptismal expressions could have a very concrete meaning insofar as both water and blood could channel pneuma. And yet, it's just as true to say that no one is literally sprinkled with the very blood that Christ shed the day he was crucified. But even if the statement is metaphorical, the ancient physiology and magic of pneuma provides the perceived reality from which the metaphor arises. This interpretive crux begs a more nuanced understanding of metaphor, and for that I turn to the cognitive linguistic science of conceptual metaphors. This field, inspired especially by the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, holds that ordinary, meaning non-poetic, non-rhetorical language, ordinary language, and thus cognitive mapping, utilizes metaphors that we scarcely recognize as such. These metaphors are fundamentally grounded in human experience, beginning with simple orientational and ontological metaphors like up is good, as in the expression moving up in the world, and spatial and container metaphors like emotion is space, as in the statement I'm in love. Likewise, structural metaphors are grounded in systematic correlations within our experience and provide the richest source of elaboration. Such conceptual metaphors structure everyday activities and value systems. Lakoff and Johnson illustrate this point using the conceptual metaphor, argument is war. As they show, this metaphor is reflected in our everyday language by a variety of expressions. His claims are indefensible. Let's attack every weak point in his argument. His criticisms were off the mark, and I do truly hope these statements are far from your mind at the moment. Significantly, we not only speak about arguments in terms of war, we actually engage in correlated activities and adopt concomitant attitudes. We see interlocutors as opponents. We plan strategies. We abandon or take new lines of attack. In short, many of the things we do in arguing are partially structured by the concept of war. Likewise, blending theory, also called conceptual integration, mental binding, and conceptual blending, this blending theory holds that mental operations combine two provenances of meaning, giving rise to a third, novel space that has new emergent meaning. For my example of all this, consider the conceptual metaphor, baptism is rebirth, for which the New Testament foundation is Jesus's dialogues in the Gospel of John, as well as Paul's words to the Galatians to the effect that Gentiles can become children and heirs of God's promises through adoption in Christ's pneuma. Scholars have long noted the ways this metaphor was developed liturgically, architecturally, and artistically among Christians, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean and among Syriac-speaking communities. John Penniman has shown how the trope of milk and solid food, originating with Paul, involved medical and philosophical discourses concerning a person's proper formation, and thus became a regulatory principle that enabled early Christian authors to designate boundaries between the thoughts and behaviors they approved and those they disapproved. This trope became associated with the metaphors of rebirth, as seen especially in the Syriac Odes of Solomon and in the work of Clement of Alexandria. The latter in particular famously relates the church to a mother who swaddles initiates in Christ's blood at their baptism in his exegesis of Luke's nativity. And Ali Katuz has argued that the early Christian tradition of holy pneuma as female and mother, her womb the font of new birth, provides the basis for 5th and 6th century depictions of Jesus receiving baptism in waters resembling the effluent of a birth canal. Now, in my own work, I've argued that identifications of the primordial church, wisdom, and the holy pneuma as mother prompted Christians, especially ones designated heretical, to associate these figures with the Virgin Mary and impart to her cosmic attributes. I discussed how this theme is evocatively portrayed in the 3rd century Gospel of Bartholomew, in a scene where Mary, called the tabernacle, is lifted by 4 apostles, and they're called pillars in the text, while she attempts to recount the mystery of how she conceived the incomprehensible. This same text is the setting of possibly the earliest intercessory prayer involving Mary, though not specifically addressed to the Virgin. Rather, it invokes her womb in a manner reminiscent of the Hermetic prayer of thanksgiving and its parallels mentioned before. And you have it there on your screen. O womb more spacious than a city, O womb wider than the span of heaven, O womb that contained him whom the 7 heavens do not contain, you contained him with pain and held in your bosom, him who changed his being into a smallest, O womb that bore, concealed in your body the Christ who has been made visible to many, O womb that became more spacious than the whole creation. The application of cognitive linguistics to the conceptual metaphor, baptism is rebirth, uncovers the mechanism by which such prayers to cosmic wombs became associated with the Virgin Mary. Given their presence in rituals that attest similar patterns to pneumatic conceptions adduced from New Testament passages, early Christian authors, and lest we forget, the cat drowning ritual, these prayers to cosmic wombs are conceptually correlated with the experiential basis of the metaphor. Indeed, medical theories consider the womb an incubator for pneumatic seed. Once the baby exits, uterine blood is refined into milk, which nourishes the child with mother's pneuma. Accordingly, one could say that the invocation of cosmic wombs was a dormant tradition, part of a provenance of meaning accessible to early Christians through the developing experience and theology of baptism, and which eventually found concrete expression through emergent identification of Mary with God's church, wisdom, and holy pneuma. Conclusion. Now, it may seem odd that I spent a significant portion of my talk today relating early Christian baptism to a filicidal ritual, as though Christ or the initiate baptized in his name could be compared to a drowning cat. It may be worth mentioning, however, that ancient Christians, likely as early as Matthew's community, compared Christ's death to the slaughter of goats, sheep, birds, and other animals on the altars of both Jewish and pagan temples. And similarly, Troy Martin has adduced statements from early Christians comparing the pneuma-induced pregnancy of the Virgin Mary with animals, especially vultures, that are said to conceive by the wind. In both cases, the juxtaposition betrays a common worldview. Tertullian compares angelic spiritus to the noetic spirits that sees a drowning person. Is the leap to a drowning animal so far-fetched? At the very least, I think that the formal and thematic parallels between the cat drowning ritual and early Christian baptism have important implications, namely an approach that appreciates, in relation to material pneuma, the ability of water to channel it, the emotional source of its profusion, the psychic and daimonic attachments to it, and the cosmological constitution of it. This approach allows us to look further beyond the purported idiosyncrasy of early Christian baptism and find greater texture in its Greco-Roman background, perhaps especially among the magical papyri. Additionally, accounting for the metaphorical nature of ordinary language and the conceptual structures that underlie its expression permits us to perceive both the concrete reality of baptismal statements and their idealization. In this way, we can discern elaborations in Christian tradition from their experiential basis, for example, the dietetic and ritual induction of pneuma, to their corollary concepts, for example, invocations of cosmic wombs. Thank you.
So our next presenter is Philip Wilson, who is a PhD candidate at Harvard University. And today, Philip will be giving a presentation titled Curse or Critique, Social Conflict and Ritual Censor in Late Antique Pastoral.
Great. Well, thanks so much to everybody for attending on this rather tepid late morning. And thank you to Professor Sanzo as well for the invitation. And thank you to the Institute for the Study of Lived Religion for making all of this possible. So I'm here first and foremost to answer a question that I'm sure is keeping all of you up at night, which is, who is Nemesianus? Nemesianus was a 3rd century North African Latin poet whose 4 eclogues have attracted little commentary apart from Stephen Hayworth's characterization in Blackwell's Companion to Roman Literature, quote, a disturbingly casual description of a double rape, end quote. He is either the first eclogic poet since Calpurnius Siculus in what was probably the age of Nero, so about 175 years prior, or on the assessment of Stover and Vothesen, perhaps since Virgil. And in this scenario, basically the dating of the Einsiedeln eclogues, another Neronian pastoral, and Calpurnius Siculus get punted upward to the time of Nemesianus and suddenly become a whole 3rd century simultaneous multimedial renaissance of pastoral all at the same time. It's attractive, but I at present lack sophistication or knowledge of the manuscripts to actually venture a judgment. But anyway, in this assessment, however, the only independent pastoral compositions between Virgil and the time of Nemesianus, it should be said, would have been those of the Dirae, a collection of curses, or a single poem that represents a collection of curses against a rival shepherd in the Appendix Virgiliana, as well as a birth amulet citing the 10th line of the 4th eclogue. But in any case, Nemesianus came to pastoral literature at an interesting moment in the history of reading, a concept invoked and discussed by Professor Sanzo in his own study of scriptural incipits on amulets. I contend that this same context, one of ritual censure, and perhaps the distinctive importance of apotropaic ritual to Roman North Africa, inspired and informed Nemesianus' own writing of pastoral poetry. Nemesianus does not, however, take a scriptural approach to amulets, but an amuletic approach to reading and writing. Nemesianus' pastoral poetry uses abundant scenes of violence, not to critique social flaws, as is often thought about Virgil's Eclogues 1 and 9 and their relationship to the expropriations of Octavian, but instead to depict pastoral poets and write pastoral poetry with the same spontaneous apotropaic efficacy of certain magical amulets. To say that pastoral poetry is a Latin genre with unique capacity to imitate magic would be uninformed if one restricted magic to the handful of rhetorical features or therapeutic contexts typically considered by students of Latin Carmina. These would include performative utterances or maybe a few medical treatments. But as we know in this room, magic is a category that denotes a much wider range of gestural, technical, and face-to-face communicative acts. Or shall we say, it is much more lived. Nemesianus' violence, specifically sexual assault, marauding across boundary lines, obstetrical peril, and bodily damage in that context, as well as non-specific psychosomatic mania that can seize you at crossroads or woodlands, reorients the whole of the Latin pastoral tradition around the exact context where apotropaic magic lived, particularly, again, in Roman North Africa. Nemesianus' citations of prior pastoral poets, such as Virgil and Calpurnius specifically, also remind readers that the genre's patented contests and strifes between shepherds over lovers or property had always already aimed for the lived circumstances where magic was potent and warranted. The evil eye in Virgil's Eclogue 3, the commissioning of an expert writer to placate an abused girlfriend who has fled to another man in Calpurnius' Eclogue 3, and the wax statuette of a male lover used by a woman for her own, quote, magical, end quote, spell. All of this is where pastoral lived as well. Nemesianus' distinctive perseveration on violence, moreover, reminds us of this connection much more forcefully than commentators have yet noted anywhere else in the genre. He teaches the reader, both within his text and without, a symbolic connection between pastoral's effects and amulets' apotropaic effects. Magic as a performed, lived religious practice both resembles pastoral song in the poetry of Nemesianus and pastoral shepherd songs in the poetry of Nemesianus give evidence of the same lived context and conflicts of magic. So to clarify why amulets and what amulets and how amulets, I'll list 5 main reasons why magical amulets of the Roman Empire might suggest themselves as Nemesianus' imagined ritual background for pastoral poetry. First, amulets are, in terms of their composition, are not as labor intensive as other magical artifacts like curse tablets or divinatory spells, or certainly the drowning of a cat. And where practitioners might need multiple different organic ingredients to be burnt or gathered from different places and then redeposited in other places, the gestural activation, to use the language of studies of magic, of the counter magical power of an amulet was oftentimes simply seeing, wearing, or reading them. Thus, they are rather bookish and suggest a cultural space where reading and writing could be magical. Second, amulets help their patients in the particular struggles that cause Nemesianus characters so much grief. These include trespassing, damage to the body during pregnancy and birth, assault in wide open spaces, and the non-specific psychosomatic mania that would eventually become demonic possession, and for which pharmaca were already described. And I should mention as well, pharmaca in the Greek pastoral tradition is often used to say what pastoral does. That by singing about a lover, you pharmacate yourself and so on. But that word is not exactly translated in Latin, so I don't cite it in Latin. Yeah, and these also including apathy, exhibiting symptoms such as apathy, loss of appetite, and so on. Some of these threats, like the harm that can be inflicted by the evil eye of those envious of our property, are also suffered by Virgil's pastoral characters. Third, both Nemesianus poetry, as well as amulets, present violence, and particularly sexual violence, with a curious mixture of graphic imagery and charming or humorous detail. This mixture is a common trope of apotropaic magic, which strives to protect by psychologically disorienting its victim onlookers with a mixture of horror and laughter. Fourth, amulets were visible on people's bodies, houses, and throughout the tombs of the countryside of the Roman Empire, and perhaps uniquely in the Roman house mosaics of Northern Africa. The effort on Nemesianus's part, therefore, to study them or understand them would not have presented a steep barrier to entry. He would have simply had to just observe and report. Finally, the 3rd and 4th centuries saw a blossoming of polemics and treatises investigating the power of amulets, as Christians and pagans vied to censure the rituals of their enemies and to perform powerful rituals themselves. This polemic was in full swing in Africa. Think of Tertullian, Julius Africanus, and eventually Augustine. Thus, once again, Nemesianus would have had occasion to think about amulets seriously and to wonder whether other powerful literature, like secular Latin poetry, could possess the nebulous and up for discussion magical power that was debated in his time. For these reasons, among others, I suggest that amulets in particular and their presentation of violent threats can help us understand Nemesianus's presentation of violent destruction in his own poetry, as well as his reading of violent destruction in prior pastoral literature. So, moving to a specific poem of Nemesianus, I'll look at his 3rd eclogue. In the rest of the chapter, I talk about all 4 of the eclogues, which is a convenient size of a corpus for a dissertation chapter, but not for a presentation. In eclogue 3, basically 2 boys run up on Pan himself. They try to steal his flute. Pan says, "Please don't do that. I will sing you a song so that you stop," and then sings them a song. This is basically Virgil eclogue 6. I imagine like much of the room attended Liceo Classico, so I won't bore you, but yeah, so anyway. I've made the claim that ugly disfiguration caused by violence in Nemesianus's poetry does not allegorically represent phenomena in social life that Nemesianus intended to critique, but rather that violence and ugliness in his poems strive for an apotropaic quality and effect by depicting ugly destruction in humorous or charming ways. I have also made the claim that in Nemesianus's particular intellectual context, there was a cultural space for an author, an expert reader or writer to enter his own poetry into a contest over what ritual means were licit and powerful enough to fight off threats to property and persons, sometimes even demons. One piece of evidence for this second claim points the way to the proof for the first. Augustine, another Roman African and one of the loudest voices, although albeit at the end, of the discourse of ritual censure, indicates sexual delict and describes sexual delict in a ritual context of a sort very similar to that described in Nemesianus' 3rd eclogue. And if I want to advance the slide, I just click, shall I, or use the...
Press the button.
Yeah, great, okay. So here's the quote. The god Liber had to be appeased in this way to ensure the success of the crops and to avert evil spells, fascinatio, from the fields. A Roman wife had to do out in the open what not even a meretrix should have been allowed to do in the theater if there were Roman wives present. And so the in this way is a description of basically, you know, lewd sexual acts, carnivalesque behavior, and so on. So Nemesianus's own eclogue 3, a riff on the Seder eclogue of Virgil's 6th, has much in common with this same ritual context. Like the ritual described by Augustine, or at least its intended effect, Nemesianus's Pan describes sexual impropriety to the end of appeasing Bacchus Liber and to stop invidious assaults on his property. Eclogue 3 and Augustine describe the same god presiding over the same types of sexual delict to the same religious end. However, the 2 passages differ in a key respect. Augustine, though later than Nemesianus, takes what was already in the 3rd century a commonplace view among Christians and even some pagan Neoplatonists. Rituals like this are merely superstitious. In Nemesianus, however, Pan's song of drunken assault successfully soothes and repels the mischievous shepherds who stole his flute. Pan's fictional success sets the stage for an inquiry into how that success is theoretically possible. In other words, it demands a definition of the operative components of apotropaic magic. And it demands, in turn, that we ask whether those components could be present in Nemesianus' poetry. Straddling and connecting both these questions is a medial third. How was Latin hexameter poetry able to, if at all, enhance or activate such apotropaic artifacts? So the word that describes Ammulet's complicated aesthetic representation of physical enclosure, of violence and humor, and their object's own interpretation of their power to enclose is apotropaic. It describes not only monumental art, but also magical uses of the aesthetics by different ritual items common to many cultures, like the evil eye, a common amulet even today. An apotropaic apotropaic mosaic at the front of a house in Roman Syria illustrates how language and imagery of ritual enclosure, as well as violence and humor, were read and functioned. The evil eye motif that you see at the top often depicted narrative events wherein threats to the property were averted because the invidiousness of onlookers was demonstrably destroyed. And so here you have the eye actually being attacked in a variety of ways. So the destruction that you want to stop, you actually do to the sort of represented onlooker in the mosaic. They also, paradoxically, often used images or representational codes for the precise harm that was meant to be averted, such as punitive sexual violence, which is suggested by the enormous phallus of the dwarven Cyclops in the Syrian mosaic. And it's it's trailing behind him, which is pretty deceptive otherwise. It's not a tail, perhaps sorry to say. Think as well of the phalluses in Priapian statuary, or even of ancient Greek herms, which were left at boundary lines. So again, the implication being, if you transgress the boundary line, you know what will happen to you, right? So thus, apotropaic art and magic derived part of its efficacy from a complex interplay between attraction to and repulsion from a represented violent act, often a sexual one, or at least penetrative, as depicted in the puncture of the eyeball here. This same dynamic operates in Nemesianus' Pastoral, and particularly Eclogue 3, with its contrast between poetic charm and ugly satyrs perpetrating sexual violence, all contained in a song sung to people who have invaded property and stolen it. In Eclogue 3, the presentation to an imagined reader of the same violent harm perpetuated by that reader, i.e., the boys' invasion of property and their perpetration of theft, soothes and disperses the malign intention that motivated them to commit the violent act. In Eclogue 3, as in apotropaic amulets, a thieving invasion, as Nemesianus describes both invasion of property and sexual assault throughout his corpus. The invadere and fortum are both used to describe sexual assault and theft in Nemesianus. When a song detailing such thieving invasion is viewed by trespassers, stops them from trespassing. So in general terms, in the third eclogue, Pan suggests that the song is an epyllion, which is to say it's an inset tale of the origin of wine and of the infancy of Bacchus. But snuck into the start of the poem is a formula with much more directly ritual power. Lines 17 to 25 of the poem render Eclogue 3 of Nemesianus into a cladic hymn addressed to Bacchus Liber, and thus quite akin to the invocation of the god that we see in Augustine above. After the hymnic address, Pan begins the narrative itself with a self-deprecating reference by Pan to the old age and the wantonness of the satyrs. But here we can begin to see the mockery of an apotropaic mode start to enter this poem. Nemesianus bolsters the grandeur of the hymn and the humor of these marks, bolsters the grandeur of the hymn with the humor of these remarks about ugliness and lecherousness. He goes on to include references to the ugliness of another satyr, of Silenus, and includes a mention of how much Bacchus loved the ugliness. So moreover, old Silenus nourished his little charge, you can read and so on. And basically, I've included, I won't read the whole quote for the sake of time, but basically there's some color coding there. And the purple actually worked a little bit. It's not so clear on the computer, but it's actually quite clear on the screen. But yeah, so you've got your charming stuff there mixed in with your funny stuff, but then already some scariness, right? We've got bristling, sort of, I mean, this is the bristling seta is that's how wild boars are described. And I guess particularly, I guess you have to get a little further south before wild boars will actually chase you and try to kill you. But in this in this country, I imagine wild boars are genuinely quite scary. So yeah, or so I've heard. Yeah, this scene shares features with apotropaic house amulets in two main ways. First, it dramatizes the key and counterintuitive point that apotropaic objects were both scary and funny, and that imagery of sexual violence or baseness could repel envy and trespassers by both charming them and scaring them. Trespassers viewing a Priapus statue, just like baby Bacchus viewing Silenus, would have laughed as well as trembled with fear. Second, however, protecting babies like Bacchus in this poem from envy was a particular specialty of apotropaic magic, according to Pliny's natural history. Fascinatio needed to be averted from the field and from newborn infants. Finally, the self-humiliation that Pan weaves into his own presentation of the ugliness of satyrs could be interpreted as the same type of self-humiliation and debasement assumed by the Roman Matronae in the quotation from Augustine, also directed at Liber. Both they and Nemesianus Silenus ward off threats to their property by debasing themselves visibly before the god Bacchus. But how can I justify making the jump between these apotropaic images and an apotropaic function of Latin poetry? Does not the visual nature of amulets exclude the written medium of poetry from embodying or approximating the apotropaic power over onlookers? In fact, on ancient apotropaia in general, the two mediums reinforced one another. Latin hexameters were sometimes used to enhance or to activate such apotropaic imagery on amulets and mosaics. One such hexameter, from an inscription on Thala, or of Thala, is an alliterative string of words decorating a phallus surrounded by ivy leaves. Thala could have been right in Nemesianus's neighborhood. Some of the verbiage on these apotropaic amulets, such as the famous Kaisu of the Syrian mosaic from a bit earlier, disclose that even when these inscriptions were neither Latin nor hexameters, they still addressed their victims and implied that future harm would come to them, similar to that which is on the image. The point is that apotropaic artifacts were sometimes meant to specifically address their invidious victims with promises in language of future harm. And in Africa, evidently, amulets did so with Latin and did so with hexameters and promised, in fact, sexual violence. So with that preface, I can move on from the rather charming physical ugliness of the satyrs to the more menacing and major ugliness of the depiction of rape in this poem. From lines 45 to 65, the satyrs, glutted on wine that Bacchus had just given them for the first time ever, assault and try to carry off a collection of nymphs. So here I didn't bother with color coding because it's all pretty scary and ugly. But yeah, so once I get a consensus of nods, I can move on. Yeah, cool. Okay, so like the phallus amulets, priapic imagery and other ritual depictions of sexual violence meant to ward off trespassing, we here find images of disgusting bodily effluvium, of musical merriment, and of violent assault. Nemesianus's Pan, by depicting scenes of rape by satyrs, could be suggesting to his assailants, i.e. the boys who stole his flute, that a similar end awaits them. Virgil's Silenus, after all, makes a similar threat to the boys and to the nymph Nyssa in Nemesianus's model, Eclogue 6, and that's I'll just return back there. That's the Virgil on the right the stage left side one. Yeah, but basically this is with Coleman's comment, or excuse me, with Clausen's comment, that green line, she will get another prize, is interpreted in the vast ancient consensus to be a promise of punitive rape. Pan could even be trying mythically and cathartically to sate the boys' lust for marauding by drawing their attention on screen rather than towards his flute. Either effect, whether charm or fear, is the desired end of apotropaic language and apotropaic images. And either inference, whether charm or fear, could have been what a late ancient Roman African found in the equivalence of sublime poetry made by Virgil's own satyr, and as well as the promise of sexual assault. Rather than a threat of rape and a charming poem, Nemesianus provides through the song of his character Pan, a charming song that is a promise of rape, all done with the language and meter of apotropaic African house mosaics. What's more, just like the inscription from Thala, Nemesianus's iphthallic poem is even bedecked with Dionysiac ivy leaves. So in conclusion, this apotropaic synthesis within the poetry of Nemesianus seems to work. At the end of the poem, the boys' behavior is soothed and emulsified. They return home and to their proper work. And what he says is basically you get the picture, right? If you had to guess how a pastoral poem ends, the goats go home and their udders are nice and plump and they're not hot anymore. So great, everybody's happy. They desist from their marauding after being presented with an imagistic poem of charm, monstrous ugliness, and sexual violence. The boys, like the viewers of the Syrian mosaic on the Orontes, saw narrative images of an ugly theriomorphic beast, of physical attacks, of potential sexual violence, and stopped doing the type of violence that Nemesianus pairs in his Eclogue 3 and as well as Eclogue 2, which is to say, trespassing, stealing, and sexual assault. And this pairing, once again, is accomplished by Nemesianus's curious Latin repetition of invadere and forti. That both things are thieving invasion, sexual violence, and trespassing. So far, it seems that Nemesianus is depicting both pastoral singing and his own generic relationship to earlier pastoral books as a similar process of experiments against similar threats. His poets present yet one of many means to induce the complicated and dense psychological mix of attraction, bemusement, and horror, which characterizes so many apotropaic magical artifacts, especially amulets. And so for the sake of time, I'll skip recapitulation of my initial premises, but I'll just remark in conclusion that, pastoral as magic was not unheard of in the time of Nemesianus, and the use of pastoral motifs on objects of apotropaic ritual power actually blossomed in his lifetime. So at the end of the 3rd century, apotropaic artifacts like sarcophagi gave pastoral new pride of place, and at least one class of gem endowed this Bacchus infancy plot with its own kind of symbolic new force. Likewise, the presence of a literate figure amidst the pastoral character in the Vatican Museum's 31540, the so-called pastoral sarcophagus of the Via Salaria, also suggests that pastoral required the charisma of a writer and of a reader. But these conjectures will have to remain questions for further research. Thank you.